So when I started at CD Baby, it was a time when for your average kind of local musician, what you would have for your web presence consisted of probably a website and then just Google searches, like people randomly finding you because they're searching for your genre or certain keywords, or maybe they're looking up shows in the area. So your presence was your website and random searches. And that all changed with the introduction of MySpace and YouTube and stuff like that. And then that grew into sort of WordPress and Tumblr blogs, then Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, real like things accelerated. But it went from a very curatorial, like I am in one place and you come find me, maybe at random, to a place where you could sort of push things out and be discoverable in a much greater sense. And that also, I think, coincided with the shift in narrative of what independent music even meant. Because when I was starting at CD Baby, I remember hearing stories of artists like Amy Mann, who had had a major label career and a big audience, and they were excited about going indie. But it's easy to be excited about that when you already had your fan discovery paid for by major labels. And I love Amy Mann. This is not to discount her, but it was a time when independence basically meant, oh, big famous artists could now reap the benefits of collecting all the money from their sales. And even if they sell a lot less because they're earning 100% of it, independence is good. That shifted towards truly like, no, I'm like an unknown artist, but I can go out and find the world, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, to piggyback on what you're saying, there was definitely like when we're starting at CD Baby, because I mentioned that we would get calls. How do I get a label deal all the time? This vibe that independence meant that you were lesser than as it relates to the music industry. Like, oh, it's too bad you're just an independent artist. Maybe someday you'll make it. And I think you can see that if listening to the podcast, going from being this squeaky wheel that at times the mainstream industry just wanted to go, for it to go away because it was a nuisance. And also, a lot of the independent artists were doing innovative things that the mainstream industry was still too scared to do, especially as it relates to the rise of social platforms. So, to me, for artists who are now entering the market, the independent segment is celebrated, and there are so many artists that make uh, huge livings, massive careers, and have chosen to maintain their independence. And you see major label artists leaving to pursue a career independently. And the independent market now makes up 40% of the market, where at the time that was not the case. It was this group of people that were sort of causing problems for the traditional system that really didn't want things to change.
As far as any of this relates to social, it seems like we recorded an episode a few months ago about like is social media dead? And we griped about all the bad habits and the bad sort of mental health stuff that social can cause, but we also have to thank it for the ability to reach anyone, to prove to ourselves or to the world that our music is valid in that way, where independence doesn't have to mean lesser than, because you can have a huge career reaching strangers out
Yeah.
there.
And that this is one of the things that was very, very critical to, I think, the growth of the independent artist community, the growth of CD Baby, and just the independent artist community becoming a creative force. And I don't just mean musically, but creative force in driving new ways of connecting with fans, because my feelings about big tech are very different these days than it was back then. Yes, nobody loved Google back then either, but it was an exciting time. It was all these things opening up. The internet was getting faster. So uploading and downloading MP3s was becoming easier. And things like MySpace, where artists were actually getting gigs based off having a good MySpace presence. And it's the first real audio player that I can remember people using for independent artists to be heard online. And you could go discover new artists basically free, and
Yeah.
have access to them. And so these platforms, it was such an exciting time at CD Baby. And if you go back and listen to the archives, a lot of our episodes were talking about how an artist was using a new platform, whether it be MySpace or YouTube or Twitter or blogging, to really drive an audience and tap into a market that didn't want top 40 music and really
Yeah.
connect directly with fans. And so it was super exciting. And
My
that was like the first wave of social media platforms, like that really everyone was super excited.
MySpace gets a lot of crap, and you and I have probably talked, it made a lot of snide jokes about MySpace, but with hindsight, I really miss it because I realize we didn't know what we had basically. It was great for what you're saying, that sort of B2B or whatever, like artist to artist co-booking tours and finding opportunities. But I also had tons of people just randomly find me. I don't know how, maybe they went through that sort of web of mutual friends or whatever, and they just write me and be like, "Hey, I heard your music. I love it." Like I was making fans through no effort of my own by just having a
Absolutely.
music player on MySpace. And then it all went away.
Well, and what was so amazing about what MySpace did that I think has not been replaced is that you could, at the time, both of us were in the Portland, Oregon area. We both had music projects going, and you could go to Seattle, find similar bands, look at what venues they're playing, and message them saying, "Hey, let's do a show swap. I'll open for you in Seattle. You open for us in Portland." And that was a major tactic artists were using to get in front of audiences in other cities. And it was so easy and led to some really great connections. I know most people are probably hearing that if they weren't a part of that thing, oh, that'd just be a bunch of garbage and spam. There was that element there, but it was actually incredibly useful in finding artists in different cities, being able to see where they're playing, see some activity stats, and know that, hey, this band would probably be a good fit for us. There really isn't an easy way to do that still.
Yeah, well, things are so scattered now. That was also a time when literally if you were on social, it meant you were on MySpace. Like
And you can do
MySpace.
stuff on Bandcamp and you could go look in bands in town, but that we're so fractured now.
Yeah.
Everybody was on MySpace then. Everybody that was an artist was the one place.
Well, and the one thing failed to mention when in the beginning of this section when I said everyone had a website and you could be found through Google searches, I left off an important thing, your email list. That was your one way you owned a connection with fans back then. And strangely, it still is. I mean, SMS lists, email, that's maybe one of the only ways to just maintain what you've built with your fans because MySpace proves that all platforms are going to go away. One day, we won't rely on Instagram the way we do now. We won't rely on TikTok in 20 years or 10 years the way we do now. These things always ebb and flow, but if you have a direct communication method, I don't think
yeah,
email or texts are going to go anywhere.
the hard lesson artists learned for the first time with the demise of MySpace was that it's super critical that you own your fan relationship. And it's funny because we've also gone through several phases of people saying email's dead, email marketing's done, no one reads email anymore. It's still email or what you said, text messaging is still the only way you can truly own the direct connection with a fan. And otherwise,
Besides
you
NFTs and social tokens.
right. So it was a hard lesson because one day MySpace deleted everything and a lot of those followers went away, a lot of those fans disappeared. So we still at times continue to make the mistake of building up other platforms, giving them all our fans, but then not having any way to contact our fans directly. And that's a critical lesson still, because if you're thinking, oh, Instagram will never go away, it may never go away. In fact, we talking about some of the things that we said in the podcast. Like, I know at one time I was like really bagging on Facebook and I'm like, Facebook's done. And this was when Instagram was really growing. Facebook hadn't bought them yet. I think maybe Snapchat was existing. I can't remember. I know Vine existed at the time. So it's like all these newer platforms were popping up. And so things may not go away, but one thing is true, what people put their attention towards definitely shifts. And those platforms have evolved to where Facebook, unless you're paying to reach your fans, you pretty much aren't going to get to them. And
Yeah.
so, incredibly important that you own your fan relationship. The other thing I wanted to add about the rise and fall of social platforms is there was this second period of time where it was super exciting because when the App Store was launched and all these cool, unique apps started coming out that were, getting tons of money and they were using music in an interesting way. But it also became the point where the tech companies put themselves in the driver's seat as far as monetization is concerned because there was sort of this too big to fail mentality for some of these platforms. They were using music illegally, they were using film illegally, photos illegally, but because it was so popular, the industry didn't know how to handle it. And I remember being at a music tech conference in San Francisco. This was probably 2010, 2011, talking to somebody that's like, oh, yeah, I've got my app that I'm designing, creating. It does all this with music and stuff. And I said, well, if you gotten the rights to use that, it's like, the rights to use it? How? Like what? Like what rights are there? And it's like, I'm in Silicon Valley. I've got investors. The rules don't apply to me. And so the tech industry really put themselves in the driver's seat of monetization. And the idea of user generated content really was born at that time. And that really was the struggle with the social platforms as it relates to monetization and who really gets to decide how this thing works moving forward.